And you guys are seeing the outside of the fire station.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the August 28th meeting of the Master Plan Implementation Committee. We're just getting started, and Mr. Leibowitz, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. As usual, we have a very ambitious agenda for this evening. So without further ado, I have to say that I am very, very pleased that the Fort Point team, the entire team is present in one form or another. Rod is here basically to take us to the next significant step, which is understanding the benefits, the trade-offs, and what we could be looking at a revitalized common, keeping in mind that revitalization means, yes, coming to life economically, socially, and basically at scale for people to actually want to and will use. So Rod, introduce yourself, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm Rod Motamedy. I'm a research manager with the UMass Donahue Institute with the Economic and Public Policy Research team. We are part of the Fort Point Associates team on this project. Our role is, as our name would suggest, the economic research component of the project. I can start with a little bit of overview. At the previous big meeting that we had, one of our teammates, Util, introduced the physical options, the change in the structures, the change in the amount of space that would be available in the common through 4 different revitalization scenarios. In their presentation and ours, scenarios 1 and 2 are combined for reasons that were discussed in detail in the previous meeting, but summarized here with they are essentially the same in space utilization with or without sewer, because the zoning provides a cap to what can be done. And then scenarios 3 and 4 have different zoning, which allows for different space usages. So our role in the sort of continuum of work, it has come back around. We did a round of work in the beginning to do some existing conditions work to give people a sense of what's happening in Littleton and what is around. That fed somewhat into Util's work. Now we are coming back in a big way to take what Util has done and then apply some economics to it. So our objectives are threefold. One is to take these spaces that Util has created and has divided into either retail, residential, or office space, to fill those spaces up with businesses, then to attach some dollar value to those businesses, whether it's the revenues that they would generate, their sales, whether it's some jobs or income that they would pay to their workers, and some estimates on incremental taxes that will be paid as a result of having higher value properties, and so forth. And then to provide some context for those findings in terms of scale compared to what's here, and so forth. At the end of this presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about economic impact analysis and how and if the committee would like us to proceed with that work, and I will give you way more explanation on why it's a how and if when we get to that, but that'll be the last part of the presentation. So first we're going to talk about the filling of the spaces, and then we'll talk about some of the economic impact work. So the first thing we had to do when it came to putting some activity inside these, I don't mean this disparagingly, but boxes. We have these boxes that are being created, and we have to put something in them. Was to figure out what type of businesses should go in there. So we have retail, office, and residential uses. The retail, we subdivided into food services and then an assortment of retail, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Office, we filled with professional technical services, was sort of the stand-in industry that we were going to put in there. That includes things like accountants and lawyers and independent consultants, and most of your sort of white-collar jobs would fit into that category. And then residential is multifamily residential. So we filled those up with people based on, we'll get into that, but based on average housing sizes and so forth. So once we figured out the types of businesses that we're going to fill these spaces, we need to figure out how they use space. So we found data on the average square feet per employee for different business types. So how many square feet per employee does a restaurant have? How many square feet per employee does a professional technical services have? In order for us to put jobs in, the jobs is a key number because the number of jobs determines the amount of wages, the number of jobs determines the amount of revenues. So getting to that jobs number is kind of your key to open the door to a lot of other economic measures. A lot of them come back to employment and depend on employment. So here's some of the relevant industries. Here's an example of the data that we have. So we pulled this for a bunch of industries, but we don't need all of that. So we've showed you some of the things that we have here: retail, food service, and professional technical services. One thing that is worth pointing out is this data specifically is something we're still working on. The Dun & Bradstreet data that we used as our source for this has a relatively small sample size. So this is Littleton specific data. So this is the businesses in Littleton that have reported both square footage and employment. So that in and of itself is a subset of Littleton's businesses, because not all of them have reported both of these numbers. And if they haven't reported both, we can't figure out the averages. We can't assign one business's employees to another business's square footage. So we had to have double reporting for every business that went into this average. So I, for example, think the professional technical services number is probably a bit high. I don't think it's 2,000 square feet per worker. I think it's probably maybe 1,000 or maybe even 500, although probably not 500, maybe 1,000. So,
Don't you have that labeled backwards?
yeah, sorry, I did. The label, this table has changed enough times where, yes, it's industry and then workers per square foot is the column on the right, not square footage. So I think retail is about right at 600. I took one of the retail sectors that were available. I think that's usually about 500 or 600, so I think that's not too far off. 150 square feet per employee for food services probably isn't that bad. It might be a little low. But I do think the professional and technical services number is too high, but we haven't found a good source to corroborate that data yet, and so that is on the pending items for us, is to find maybe a national source or a state source or something to get another average for these to help us at least get a sense of how good this number might be.
I would think that retail and food services probably correlates regardless of where you're doing retail or food services.
Yeah.
Now, professional and technical could vary depending on if you have lawyers versus accountants versus
Right.
some other type of, I mean, lawyers and accountants could correlate, but I don't know, something else might not correlate to lawyers, so it would depend, right?
Right. So what I'm worried about, so when I said this could be as much as 500, I think that's 500 makes sense if you're in an office tower.
Right.
But, here where you're talking mostly sole proprietor kind of
Right,
businesses,
Right.
I think 2,000 is probably a bit much,
Okay.
but I don't think 1,000 is that far off the mark.
Okay.
1,000 square feet for an office with a lawyer, an architect, or somebody in it
Right.
doesn't seem that far off the mark. So that has also been the difficulty of trying to find a number for professional technical services of the type that are present or are likely to be present in the common.
Right.
It's not going to be a big office block, big office tower is going to go up. It's going to be small independent,
Right.
So.
Okay.
Which is why I have used this data.
Right.
If I thought it was really crazy, I wouldn't have even put it in here and
Right.
used it for our analysis. But I do think it is more valid than not, and
Okay.
thus it's in the presentation. But we are still trying to, kind of hammer at this a bit more and see if we can get a bit more precision on this data specifically. So then we have a household size. So we need to fill up these residential units in some way. And so we pulled household size data based on whether it's going to be owner occupied or renter occupied. Because we don't know whether the multifamily housing that ends up getting built is going to be condos or apartments. But they're going to be, so if they're condos, you are likely to have slightly larger households. People who own housing tend to have more people. If they are going to be rental units, they tend to have fewer people. So this is for Littleton as well. So in Littleton, well over half of rental units are single-person households. So we don't expect that to be any different, especially because these would be units on top of commercial. They likely wouldn't be as big. They won't have yard space. You know, they won't. I don't think that we would have any reason to expect that somehow these are going to have a larger. They can have larger households. Or if they're senior housing, even more reason that you have single-person households. So here are single-person households as a share of all households. And so you can see the 65 plus, basically a third of all households in Littleton that are headed by somebody who's over 65 or over are single-person households. And that's the combination of 25 and 8%, the red and the yellow bars. The red is the share of all households headed by someone over 65 that are single family and owner occupied. The yellow is single family, single person and renter occupied. If you add the two together, you get 34% of all households headed by someone 65 and over are single person. You see that number even goes up even higher as you get into 75 and over. So again, the propensity for smaller households carries to renters, and the propensity of smaller households carries to the older population. You can look at this in a different way. So this is the percentage of single-person households by age within the tenure, within the occupancy type. So let's look at that 87% bar for the 65 to 74-year-olds. So that says of all renter-occupied housing that is occupied by someone who's 65 to 74, 87% of those are single person. So if you are 65 to 74 and you rent, it's almost guaranteed that that's a single person household.
Can I ask, why is the first grouping 15 to 54? Why isn't that like 18 to 24, 24 to 34?
That's the way the census collects the data. And the reason being that the census data is far more concerned about this type of housing distribution as you get older.
Okay.
With the assumption being that in that age range, they're working, people are working, people have, might have double two earners in the household.
Right.
You're more likely to have children. And so,
Like it would seem to me intuitively that 18 to say 26,
yeah,
you're still going to have a lot of single person households.
yes.
Because they haven't gotten married, they haven't had kids yet. So is there another way to tease that out, another source of the data that we can look at some point?
The data is more detailed at larger geographies, and larger geographies do support, in fact, what you are saying. So I think most 15-year-olds tend to be in a
Yes, well,
most
I think
15-year-olds
that's ridiculous that number's
tend
even
not
there.
to be head of household,
Right.
So this is by the age of the head of household.
Yeah.
So most 15-year-olds are in someone else's household
Correct.
and are not head of household.
Right.
But yeah, I agree that up to probably 30, you're far more likely to have
Yeah.
either single person or two,
Right.
but no children.
Yeah.
So I think that's a different way of looking at it. I think perhaps rather than splitting that up, it might be what percentage of households with children. Maybe might be a
Yeah.
different way of
Interesting.
looking at it rather than
Because I think
splitting it up.
that the discussion that we've had at our meetings and that we hear as a town is that more diversified housing stock is the emphasis for us because of the community we are, is on our older population, which is why this is valuable. But in order to be economically sustainable, it can't only be the elderly.
Right.
Right? There are some people who don't want to own a house who are, or don't want to even live in a house.
Right.
They want that smaller footprint for any number of reasons. I don't know that Littleton is the most viable place for that. Like, I think Waltham and Watertown and Lowell would be more attractive.
Right.
But that's not to say Littleton would be unattractive to some portion of that. So I don't think it's going to be a huge driver on this. I think that what you're emphasizing is going to be the more significant driver, but I wouldn't want to necessarily ignore that aspect of it when we're trying to think about it.
Yeah, and your intuition is right. So the other data that's available does support
Right.
your observation that there is that young professional, out of college, before kids kind of age range where people are more apt to be renters,
Right.
and they're more apt to have smaller households.
Right.
So you know, you're going to have the, you know, the dual income, no kids kind of households, you know, and, you know, and, you know, they might not have the money to buy, or as you said, they might not have the desire to buy.
Right.
If they're mobile for work, if they don't expect to be there for 10 years, there's no
Right.
point in buying.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
You know, so,
So, Rod, quick
yeah,
question. So you said this is Littleton data?
yeah.
So that says that people between 55 to 64 years old, 77% of them are renting.
No. So
77% of the
77% of the
renters.
people who rent are in single-person households. So the thing about it this way, so this is as a share of all households. So 19% of all households 55 to 64, or 13% of all households 55 to 64 are renters in single-family homes, or in single-person households, which means that if you add that up, that's what, 32%. So that leaves essentially 60-some-odd% of the households that are either 2+, or rent or own, but it's kind of hard. These are out of 100.
Okay.
These are out of 100. These are not out of 100.
Okay.
So these are within their own bar. So each bar is at its own share of 100. So 77% of households headed by 55 to 64-year-olds that are renters are single-person households, whereas this one says 13% of households headed by a person that age rents and is single person.
Okay. Thank you.
I realize that's a bit confusing, which is why I put both charts in there and then trusted that I could explain them. So then this is just the punchline of all that. If you distill all of that, the fact of the matter is, if you're owner occupied, you have 2.8 people on average per household. If it's a renter occupied, you have 1.7 people on average. And these then go into feeding into the number of people that would occupy the housing that's being created. So then we get into the dollar value. So we have filled up the spaces. We have workers per square foot. We have the number of people per household. We have some industry distribution. So now we need to attach some monetary value to these things that we found. So first thing we did was finding sales per worker by industry for the relevant industries that we showed you, the income by worker for these industries, and then average rent per unit. The point of collecting this data was that it's needed to estimate the incremental taxes, and it also would feed into any future economic impact analysis that we were to do, and frankly, it's just useful to know, if for no other reason than that. Sometimes you don't need a reason to know something, it's just useful to know. So this is sales per worker, so this is the amount of revenue that a business can expect to earn per employee.
And this is an annual number?
This is an annual number. This is a 2018 estimate that we took from the economic model that we have. This data is not available at the state level from any public sources, mostly because the public sources don't tell you how much money businesses make. So it's only available at the national level, which we felt missed a lot of regionalization. So we took this data from our REMI model. It's for Worcester County, not for Littleton, but that was a far better estimate than we were going to get from anything else. So we think it's a pretty reasonable estimation of what can be expected for Littleton. So if you have, if you have a small restaurant with 5 people, you're going to get 5 times $76,000 of revenue. That's about what the average business would be able to expect. In terms of wages, here are wages. These are also for Littleton. This came from the state's ES202 data, the quarterly census of employment and wages. I really don't know why the state still calls it ES202. But this is also important to point out because this is Littleton only data, which is why, for example, wholesale trade has a far higher average wage than finance. Because the finance in Littleton is the banks. It's not
Fidelity.
It's not Fidelity. It's not Goldman
Goldman
Sachs.
Sachs.
It's the community banks. That's what's in
it's the
finance.
tellers.
Right. That's what's in finance in Littleton. Right. So, professional technical services also tends to be a lot of sole proprietors. So the average wage isn't watered down with like office and admin staff, which is why the average wage is $120,000.
What about IBM?
They are in information. They're elsewhere in this. They wouldn't be in there. They would be. why are they not on my chart? Anyway, they're not on my chart for whatever reason.
They're not under professional and technical
No,
services?
professional, no, they would be under information, which for whatever reason is not on this chart. Nevertheless, they're not in one of the common businesses, so.
Oh.
But professional technical services is, retail is, and others. So these are the wages that we ended up using for to drive the project. And it's also, again, to remind you, these are not average wages in these industries. These are the wages that the data collected for Littleton says are the wages for these industries. So we now have revenues, we have wages. I have not told you about cash rents. Rents, we actually ended up taking from the assessor's assessment tool. And we'll get to those when we talk about some of the context stuff and we get to the taxes. But Kathy Miller shared with us the income approach tool that she uses for estimating taxes. And that includes sort of system average rents and some observed rents for various business types and for residential, and that's what we used. It would be used for that. So we used the rents that the assessor uses to estimate taxes when there is no income statement, which is what we have here. We don't have income statements for these businesses. We don't have well, income statements for the property owners or expense statements for these property owners because these are at this point hypothetical properties. So they're all a bit estimated. So let's provide some context. Now the question is, we have a sense of the scale of the businesses that are going in here. We have a sense of the number of housing units and the number of people per household. How does this actually fit into what is going on in Littleton right now? How does it fit into the supply gaps that we talked about earlier, which I'll refresh you guys on? How does this fit into population growth? And how does this fit into labor availability? A sneak preview, labor availability is one of the things we're still working on. That's the other pending item, is the commuting. I don't think it's going to be a huge problem because when we get into number of workers, I don't think it's going to be a major problem, but I will talk about what's still pending on that when we get there. So this is the retail supply gap that I showed you guys 2 presentations ago when we did the existing conditions. This is the same thing. What's new here are the 2 right-hand columns. So this is average sales per square foot for various types of retail. And then this is the estimated number of square feet that would be needed to close that supply gap. So let's talk about what this gap is. So restaurants and other eating places, you have $11.6 million retail supply gap. That means the residents of Littleton purchase $11.6 million more restaurant services than the restaurants in Littleton sell. So there's an excess, basically tells you that's how much they're consuming outside of Littleton. So the idea is, one of the things you asked us to think about is how would this area interact with the point? How does it differ from the point? So we thought one way that it would be obviously different is it would be much more likely to cater to the local population rather than being a big thing off the highway with easy parking that you could get people from all over the place. So our thought was, what would the local population want? If this is a common for the residents of Littleton, and it'd be lovely if other people came and partook from its amenities, but let's start with the assumption that it's going to be Littleton residents first and foremost. That's why we're focusing on these supply gaps. So these are the things that we know are undersupplied in Littleton. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, nobody goes to a clothing store anymore, so why is he telling us there's going to be clothing stores? Or sporting goods stores, or whatever. The reason we picked these is, one, that there is a known demand gap. So people are clearly buying these things, not in Littleton. 2, you'll notice that they have a very diverse range of average sales per square foot. So rather than picking one of them and saying $300 per square foot is the number we're going to go with, we chose a range that includes $200, $300, $400, and everything up to $900 for like a small jewelry store or like a luxury goods store. So we thought with that range and distributing it over that range, it would capture reasonably well any type of business that would actually come into the common. understanding that if it's going to be a clothing store, it's not going to be an Old Navy. It's probably going to be something small and, you know, like a boutique that would be more appropriate for the space and more appropriate for the clientele. Department store, you're thinking they're not going to put a Macy's in the middle of the common, but
Put Macy's anywhere.
or anywhere, frankly. But department stores could also include those what they're calling like village common stores that Target and Walmart and Whole Foods and all those places are experimenting with. There's no reason to say that something like that couldn't be in the future, especially farther down near Donnellan's. You know, so there are. Don't think of this as a huge big box Target, you know, or something like that. They have smaller form factors that would fit. Plus, it's a nice, you know, again, in-between number for sales per square foot. So that's the reasoning behind these. I don't want people to get fixated on, well, Rod said there's going to be a jewelry store. Like, that's not what I'm saying. So there could very well be a jewelry store, but there might not be. Okay, so that's the supply gap. So now, here is the summarized change in square footage that's coming out of UTIL's scenarios. So square footage for retail, office, residential. Then we converted the residential into units, so we could fill those up. And then I'll show you, we have a couple of the renderings, but we'll get into that in a moment. So for retail, we assumed 50% of retail will be food services. That's something that we heard both through our reading of the master plan and through the public workshop that we did and just taking a walk through town with you guys. Everybody seemed to think that the residents want food services, bakeries, coffee shops, small restaurants, and so on. Everyone seems to be open to that. If there's excitement about it, that will also incentivize investors and developers to put money into it. They're not going to put money into something that nobody wants. So we figured 50% food services, and then the other 50% we distributed across those remaining retail categories that we showed you, again, just to get a diversity of sales per square footage is really what we end up using those for. For office, as we said, we're doing professional technical services as our relevant sector because, again, we're looking at what's here, and we think it's going to be a lot of, you know, sole proprietors, you know, independent professionals, and that would be a good fit for the space. So, and for residential, we filled it in two different ways, one as rentals, one as condos, and to get a sense of scale of on the low end and on the high end of average household sizes. Now, one of the things you will recall that UTIL went through a pretty extensive exercise to find developable properties. They didn't say that just by changing zoning, every property would be readily redeveloped because of various reasons that they went through. So I went through and counted, just to give you a sense of scale. So for scenarios 1 and 2, which the best way to think of it is max development of existing zoning, you'd only have 6 properties that would be high propensity to redevelop. Scenario 3, there's 23, and scenario 4, there's 28. So the number of redeveloped properties doesn't change dramatically between scenarios 3 and 4. But you'll notice that the total square footage does, and that's because the sites are being used a bit more intensively because of the changes in the zoning.
Can I ask a question? Why do we assume in scenario 3 that office space doesn't change?
There's a good reason for that, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if the UTIL folks or Julie remember, but it was explained to me, and I admittedly don't remember. So,
Okay. But there's a
rather than
reason
make
for
up
it.
something, there is a reason for it.
Okay. I won't worry about it for now.
So I had a
Yes.
question back there.
Yeah.
Around the assumptions for the residential units.
Mhm.
Do you have any sense as to what amount of square feet each unit would be?
So we assumed 1,100 square feet per
Okay.
unit to convert that residential net square footage to a number of units. So
Okay,
that's
great.
kind of an average size apartment.
Thank you.
Yep. So here's a reminder from what these looked like. So this was that zoom in area that we had in the workshop. So this is the scenario 3, the stacked version that seemed to be far more popular than the 2 separate on one property. So this is the scenario 3 example, and this is scenario 4. The purple is the office that you don't see in scenario 3. And so this is what, imagine this again distributed over 23 or 28 properties across the whole common. and that's what we're trying to fill up. Now, again, one of the things that is important to point out is that the stuff that follows assumes that this is fully built out. That's obviously going to happen incrementally over time. So the numbers we're talking about are not snap of the fingers. There is now 28,000 new square feet of restaurants. So this will come on incrementally, which, a bit of a sort of preview, is one of the reasons I didn't stress too much about the labor availability question, is that even though we might be talking some number of hundreds of jobs, we don't need them all tomorrow. So, being able to incrementally find 5 or 10 or 15 people is a different challenge than having to find 500 people all at once. So here's the proposed uses for retail. Again, retail includes food services. So scenario 1, the available supply gap is filled up long before you get to some of the other types of stores. And as you can see, we've kind of assigned a bit of a priority to them. We figured restaurants first, kind of clothing, boutiques, and so on, and then kind of a catch-all sort of store next, and then the other things is a bit lower priority, so which is why we didn't get to them in these scenarios where the supply gaps run out. So we have 28,530 square feet of net square footage for new retail. That fills up thusly in scenarios 1 and 2. You can see down there on that first section, using our industry distribution, the full supply gap needs, we'll round up, 124,000 square feet of space to generate the amount of revenue that would satisfy this full supply gap here. Does that make sense? So in scenario 1, 2, and 3, the net square footage in those 3 cases is less than 124,000 square feet. So all of the available new space could conceivably be filled just using the Littleton supply gap, the demand gap. Now, obviously, you're not going to capture 100% of those dollars. You're going to get some out-of-towners and so on. But as a sense of scale, that's sort of what's happening. Scenario 4 has almost 50,000. I hesitate to use the word excess, but we'll call it excess square footage that would require outside demand. It would more than satisfy the gap that exists in Littleton, and it would require enough business from elsewhere to fill up another 50,000 square feet of space. So it's not insignificant. As you can see, it's essentially double the restaurant square footage, half of the clothing square footage, and 3/4 of the sporting goods, hobby, musical instruments, or miscellaneous store. So it's not an insignificant bump that we're talking about. But again, that's assuming today's supply and demand. One might think, what about the new people that would be living in the common? In its maximum utilization, we're only talking 370 units for the common. Even if all of those were 2-person households, that's only 700 people. 700 people by themselves are not going to make up the entire town's food services supply gap, right? So it's important to acknowledge that they're a ready customer base and they provide foot traffic, and they're probably an important key to kickstarting the ambiance and the what's the word I'm looking for? Feasibility of the common, but by themselves, they're not going to close a gap of that size.
So it's a combination of those new folks plus the
Right,
existing
plus the existing.
residents.
Precisely. So we get into the residential. I could have just skipped, went forward a slide, and rather than making it all, believe me, this is true. You can look at it on the slide. So scenario 1 and 2, we didn't have any new incremental residential. Scenario 3 and 4, if you take the square footage divided by 1,100, you get either 180 or 374 units. If you fill that up with renters, the average housing size of renters, you get either 301 or 625 incremental people. And if you look at it on the right side of that, if you fill it up with the 2.8 average housing size of owners, you have about 500 or 1,000 incremental people. So in terms of the growth, the maximal scenario 4 with larger household sizes, that would be an increment of about 11% of the current town population. Now, again, for however many years in the future this gets built, but as a percentage of today's population, it's about 11%. To give you a sense of scale, again, in the next 20 years, or not 10, 15 years or so, Littleton is expected to grow by about 5%. However, that growth is going to be unevenly distributed. It's going to be very much in the upper end of the age range. So the estimates right now are 900 net new, an increase of 900 over 65s, and about 80 20 to 40 year olds. So put 20 or 40 year olds in there, Mike, because I figured they would also want to rent. So we're looking at 980, almost 1,000 people who have a higher propensity to live in small households and would have a desire to live in multifamily households. So the question is that a sufficient number to fill these spaces over time in the future? I think the case is at least reasonable that the population distribution over time would at least make a case for filling these spaces. It doesn't strike me as excessive in relation to the way the population is changing.
Seems reasonable.
It seems reasonable. So let's see, anything else I want to point out here before I move on? Oh, right, so the rents. We filled them with $1,000 a month rents, which is a bit low. But I went low because low rents yields low taxes, and because I'm doing everything very hypothetically, I didn't want to overestimate the incremental tax revenues. So I went with, that's the average of the system rents in the assessor's model right now. That's what the rent is for about a 1-bedroom. So it's about 800 for for a so that's about the average. It's 800, 1,000, and about 1,200 are what the system rents are for various size apartments. So I went with 1,000. That is lower than some of the observed rents in the common, which could be a couple $100s a month higher. So give you a sense of the scale of my conservative assumption, which is fair to you to know. I chose something that could be a couple $100s a month lower than what some of the observed rents are, not wanting to create overly optimistic tax estimates. Because I know that people are going to focus on those, and I don't like to be the author of the number if I think it's overly optimistic. So
Be conservative instead.
that's the rationale here. But you guys should be clear about what my assumptions were, and if you would disagree with them, we can recalculate it in another way. So here's just a quick workers needed to fill the office space. Again, I suspect that you might be able to add another 50% onto some of these numbers, because I think 2,000 is a bit overly generous for square feet per worker for professional technical services. So you might be more in the 15 or 18 range, and maybe closer to 100 or so for scenarios 1 and 4. So what does all this mean? So here it is summarized. I know you're thinking, well, Rod has been talking for approximately 50 minutes and hasn't given us a punchline yet. So it's a long one. So here is if you take all of that, average this and average that, and you actually do the math out and do all the multiplications, this is what you get. So if you look at the total number of workers, so in your maximally developed with existing zoning, you could add another 130 odd workers to the common area as we've defined it for the study. Scenario 3, 460. Scenario 4, let's call it 790. So these are not insignificant numbers. And so, as I said, it would be hard in the Massachusetts of today with less than 3% unemployment to hire 500 people at a shot. I don't need to do the labor availability analysis to tell you that. However, we're not hiring 500 people at a shot. It could take a decade or more for all of these things to get built. And so this stuff would come on incrementally, and I don't think that will be problematic. If the labor environment stays the way it is right now, I think your biggest difficulty would be food services. That seems to be a particularly tight labor market across Massachusetts. And so it might be, if you were to try to hire 300 restaurant workers right now, you would have a very hard time. We are experiencing it quite acutely in Western Mass because the MGM casino just opened, and they needed, 400, 500, restaurant workers at a shot, where in, Western Mass, an experienced sous chef or line cook, that's a solidly middle-class job. That's like a $50,000 a year job, with the Western Mass living expenses. So, you can tell it's tight when those are the wages that are being paid. And so, if the environment stays the way it is now, that I think would be your hardest thing to fill. Now, assuming it's all built and it's all filled, those jobs translate into the revenues that you see on the next block there. So we'd see about 13 million, about 45 million, or $80 million in new business revenues occurring within the common. Those workers in the first block would get paid the following wages you see down there below you, either 4 million, 10 million, or $24 million of new wages, again, annually, that would be coming to people. If these buildings were fully built, if they were filled, and things are running as average, this is what you would have. Any questions on this before we switch gears and talk about taxes? Okay, let's talk about taxes. So let's talk about how we came up with this number in the first place. The taxes are calculated in two ways that are supposed to reconcile. The first is called the cost the cost approach, which is what would it cost to replace the building. The model that does that takes into account the age of the building, how much is depreciated, the type of building that it is. A warehouse is going to be different than an apartment of equal square footage. It's also going to look at, to use a non-technical term, the fanciness of the building, the quality of the fixtures, the quality of the flooring, the quality of all that stuff comes into the replacement cost. So, a building of 10 fancy apartments is going to have a higher assessed value than 10 sort of middle of the road or lower end apartments, just because of fixtures and building quality and so on, even if they equal square footage and everything. There's also a market approach that is used, and that looks at essentially the income and expense statement that the property owner fills out every year for the assessor. This is how much money I made on my property. This is how much it cost me to administer and maintain my property. The difference is then used to calculate the assessed value for the apartment or for the building. The market analysis is reactive. It is not proactive. So until a market event occurs, which results in lower vacancies or higher rents or lower maintenance costs, those are not reflected in assessed values. So just because, let's say a building is fully leased out and you're in the middle of a boom and neighboring buildings are getting 20% more rent than this building is, this building doesn't get assessed at a higher value because it can't kick out its leased tenants and bring in people at higher rents. So until those market transactions occur, the assessed value doesn't go up. So because these are hypothetical buildings with no market transactions occurring on them, we used the model's sort of guideline values. So it has guideline values for rents per square footage. It has guideline values for vacancy rates. It has guidelines for expense ratios, for reserves, and for the cap rate, the capitalization rate that's used to convert income into assessed value. So using that model and those guidelines, we figured out what the incremental assessed value of the residential properties would be, the retail, the restaurants, and the offices. Then we applied the appropriate tax rate to them, and we got these numbers here. So column from left to right. First column, scenarios. Second column, this is how much the net new square footage, the new square footage would be assessed. Now, in order for those things to happen, the existing building has to go away. So I pulled the current assessments on all of the existing buildings. That's what you get in the middle, the third column. And then the last column is the increment. So if you subtract 2, this is what you get. So you might think to yourself, man, $100,000 is not a lot, but $100,000 is almost double, it's double what's there. So if it's 80,000 there, you could take the 80,000 away. You took that 80,000 away and put new things on it, you come out 100,000 ahead. So, it's if you had the 80, if you double, you get 160, so you're getting 180 something thousand. So while it doesn't seem like a lot of actual dollars, the increment is not bad. Scenario 3 actually ends up having the smallest increment, even though it has a lot of revitalization because there's a lot of properties involved. There's 23 properties, and so taking away 23 properties takes away a lot of assessed value. So you still come out ahead, and as you do in every scenario. But again, these are using lower than observed rents, and these are using current system values. So presumably, if these buildings were revitalized, there was more traffic, they would command higher rents, they would have higher revenues, and so these assessed values would likely be higher than what the current guidelines would suggest these buildings would be assessed at. There are future market transactions that would probably bring that to bear, but again, in order to not be accused of providing overly optimistic tax assessments, I used current values, which incorporate your current rents, which would likely be far lower than what a brand new revitalized common would justify. So even with quite conservative assumptions, everything still comes out incrementally ahead of where it would be. On top of this, you recall the restaurants had revenues of $7 million, $11.5 million, and $23.5 million in the revitalized scenarios. If you take the 0.75% local option and throw that on there, in scenario 1 and 2, you get $51,000 of net meals tax, $87,000 in scenario 3, and $176,000 in scenario 4 of meals taxes. I didn't actually go look at the current property uses to figure out how many of those might be restaurants and thus what the increment might be, but there's not a lot, so I figured that's probably about right. But that's not netted of any restaurants that might be lost due to redevelopment, but I think it's probably fine. So pending, I've already explained these to you, we want to corroborate the workers per square foot data with additional sources because of the small sample size that we're getting from Littleton. We want to finalize commuter flows and availability of labor, mostly just to say we've crossed that T and dotted that I, but given that the scale, the time frame on which these properties would come in, I don't really think labor availability is going to be a huge impediment, but I do want to say we looked at it and we have at least quantified it and have provided something intelligent to say about that. So that concludes this part. The next thing I have is the discussion for the economic impact stuff, but I didn't want to transition to that in case there are questions.
Well, we'll just go around the,
Okay.
right? Wow.
You're the boss, so.
Well, I'm not, it's just arbiter. Questions, Lyle?
This is an entirely different problem-solving method than anything I've ever used, but I will say I am fascinated to the extent that you're envisioning something that does not exist yet and painting a picture for us. I probably have to
Utile
let
does
this...
the pictures. Mine are all tables.
I get it. Architecture's the marriage of art and science.
Metaphorical picture.
I get it. Probably need to let it wash over me a
Sure.
little bit more, but I'm seeing what we're talking about more than I saw when I was here last time.
Great.
Mr. Leibowitz.
Why is this an important issue to be concerned with? Can we put this into something, to do with Littleton's economic future? Suppose Littleton's economic future doesn't have this. Suppose Littleton's economic future does have this. Does that, change overall Littleton's economic future? Is it a little bit of a change? Is it a big change?
So, in terms of scale, obviously, we looked at the scale on the residential, in business terms, it's not an insignificant change, especially in such a concentrated area. I think it would be a very different feel for the town to have this amount of, again, if fully developed and fully implemented, this amount of economic activity in such a concentrated space. But I think the larger point of the exercise is to answer two questions: yeah, right, and so what? So the yeah, right is okay. So you told me we're going to put all these pretty buildings and all this space. Can we even fill them? So part of the thing that I wanted to do here was let's look at the scale of the proposed construction versus some of the demonstrated economic capacity of the town, to see if they even, in a order of magnitude sense, make sense, right? So, which is why I focus so much on that supply gap. Let's look at the demonstrated sum of money that people in Littleton are already spending. We're not asking them to spend anything new. We're just asking them to spend it in a different place. So it's already in people's household budgets. It's already something they've factored this money into their savings plans and their kids' college and whatever it might be. So the question is, if you can convince them to just spend it in a different place, is there money available? And basically, up through scenario 3, yes. The answer is yes. The scale of the revitalization would fit entirely within the amount of money that Littleton residents are currently spending elsewhere. So if you get them to spend it in town, it would provide enough money for all of the businesses that would fill all of the revitalized space. At least the food services and the retail. The office folks are going to have to find their own. They're not customer facing. They have to find their own business case. And on the residential side, in terms of the scale of the population growth and the way the population is changing, it also seems reasonable that the number of units we're talking about could reasonably be filled with population that we're already expecting. So none of this assumes that Littleton becomes a more attractive place to live. None of this assumes that people become wealthier. It's just looking at everything as it already exists. Does this stuff make sense in scale? And I think largely yes. Scenario 4, the amount of revitalized space would exceed the supply gaps. So you would be asking people to either repurpose more spending, or you'd have to require, it would draw people from out of town in order to fully fill those spaces with businesses. Then there's the so what, right? The so what is, again, where some of those dollars and cents come in. There's this many new jobs, there's some incremental tax revenue, there are new wages that would be paid to residents. It's one of the other reasons I want to look at the commuter flows to figure out who would be getting these wages. I don't think it's spoiling it for anyone to say it would probably be largely people who don't live in Littleton, because they would largely be the ones who would be filling these food services and retail jobs, given the labor pool in Littleton. But that's also extension of that. So what is where the economic impact analysis comes in that we'll talk about here in a minute. There's all the direct stuff that happens in Littleton. There'll be these people, there'll be these jobs, there'll be this amount of economic activity, there'll be this amount of new taxable value. But then that's a pebble in a lake, and those ripple effects extend outside of Littleton, and that's what the economic impact analysis would allow us to measure. How big are these ripples and how far do they extend beyond Littleton?
The reason that I do find this fascinating to envision is because I live out toward Boxborough, where over the past decades there have been great big boxes built that have been empty for many of the years.
Is that why they named it Boxborough? Is that what they named it, Boxborough?
Oh, thank you, very good. Extra points for that.
Thank you very much.
Right. The only thing I would like to make sure that I understand better, and, you know, I can research this, but is the lack of office space growth in scenario 3. I just intuitively, that doesn't make sense to me that we would just give up on that economic sector. And it would change a lot of the modeling if we added some of that in there.
Yeah.
Not dramatically. When you talk about the supply gap,
Yep.
I think one thing to keep in mind is that this is a model, so there are assumptions. And using the supply gap, I think, is very edifying, but no one should ever assume that, and you said it, that every dollar of the supply gap, because we offer these things in Littleton, people are gonna say, oh, why go to Westford? No, I wanna go to Westford because I have a relationship with that store or that provider, whatever it
Right.
is. On the other hand, we are a pass-through town. We get a lot of traffic, so people might decide, oh, instead of stopping in Acton, I'll get a little farther closer to home before I stop to avail myself of these kinds of services. So I think that kind of might all wash out. In scenario 4, when we talk about we've exceeded the supply gap and now we're reliant on really enticing people to come here versus other surrounding areas, I think as a community, we have to decide what our tolerance for that is. Because that's a different idea than what you're talking about when we were saying, oh, no, we're just gonna provide these amenities primarily for ourselves. But when you look at the tax growth, obviously scenario 4, the tax growth is significantly higher than it is in the other two. And then the other thing that I noticed was that, you know, when we talk about housing development or residential development in that area, I just quickly said, okay, you know, the two numbers you used were 1.67 members of a household to 2.83, and you model both of them. Well, if you average that out, it's 2.25, which would be about 400 residents in scenario 3. And I think that's a good number for us to be aware of as a community, because we are dealing with growth and trying to come to terms with it, because we've had a lot of housing growth in town, and we've seen the impacts, or we're starting to feel the impacts. But on the other hand, 400 people against what our total population isn't a shocking number.
No.
Nobody should be having sticker shock over that and saying, oh my God, why would we build one apartment? Well, we probably do want to build some apartments. That's been a big emphasis during the master plan update process and now into the implementation process, is that we need diversified housing stock. And diversified housing stock versus where we are, which is single-family houses, is apartments or condos that are clustered together. That's what we're talking about. And to think that, well, in this one stretch of town, if we did that, it would be 400 people, I think helps us envision what the impact would be, and hopefully in a good way. But
Yeah.
some people are going to say no matter what, and other people,
400 people in, you say 200 households. So,
Right.
you know, in 200 households, you have, what, 3,000 households right now, something like that.
Right.
So, you know, it is a pretty small,
right,
you know, in terms of
relatively
number
speaking.
of households. Yeah.
Right. So I enjoyed it. I thought it was very interesting. And I think we do need to let it wash over us a little bit, but that's where I am right now.
So to add a little bit to what Mike was just saying about numbers, based on some numbers I've looked at, Mike, the town has essentially experienced a population growth of about 1,000 people every decade. And so if we were to say within the common space, that's 400, then, you know, there's still probably going to be another 600 moving into town somewhere
Right.
else. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to comment on the retail space in terms of the dollars. We have a lot of families in town with young children, and one of the comments that I hear or see sometimes out there is, well, I have to drive to X place to get children's shoes or athletic equipment for my children's athletic activities, and boy, wouldn't it be great if there was something like that here in town. So what I hear you saying is that rather than increasing dollar amount, what folks in Littleton might be doing is that existing dollar that's currently spent elsewhere in another town would now be spent in Littleton. That's what you're saying.
That's what we're using as the
Okay.
basis for our, yeah, so sporting goods, hobby, musical, that's sort of exactly the type of thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So currently, estimate is that Littleton residents spend $5.5 million on that kind of retail outside of Littleton.
Okay.
So the idea is that that's $5.5 million of what economist types would call import substitution that's available to you. That you could provide locally to substitute away from
I like
imports,
that word,
essentially.
import substitution,
Yeah.
you said?
Widely used term for trade theory, actually, much more so than
Does that
this kind
include
of thing.
online sales as well as brick and mortar sales?
Yes, kind of. There is a separate category for non-store retail that would capture that kind of stuff. So, in the strictest sense, no, it does not include online. How precisely clean that is, I'm not entirely sure. But in a strict sense, no, it would only include brick and mortar shopping.
Right, but, excuse me, just to expand that comment. One thought about that, though, is in Littleton, you're more likely to go online because of the lack of opportunity to purchase those things within 3 square miles of your house.
Yep.
And if you had more opportunity, then some of that online sales might stay in town as well.
Yeah,
That's one
especially
way to
now
think
that
about
the
it.
sales tax is charged on the online transactions, that the price difference is not as drastic as it used to be. And in the sense that people prefer instant gratification to even a 2-day wait for Prime delivery, say, I'll pay a couple dollars more and I can have it right now. Or I can pay a couple dollars more and my kid can try on the shoes, or try on the ice skates, or try on the batting helmet.
There's still something to be said.
Well, that
You know.
sounds logical, except the trend has been clearly for those stores to disappear.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen, even sort of not too far from here, I don't know, 15 miles at Solomon Pond Mall, some of the stores that used to sell that kind of stuff don't exist anymore.
I think
And,
that's,
and you sort of wonder whether that is, I mean, I'd love to see some of those
I think
kind
it's,
of
I don't know if
things
that's
here,
an
but-
artifact that people are buying more of those things online, or people just aren't going to malls anymore. Because there's sort of that's a simultaneous sort of current. That's I think that there's still a demand for street side retail in a place that I think the mall has become like the town common. Rather than going to the mall, that's like an enclosed town common where I can browse along and do some window shopping and then go eat and then do some more window shopping. I think people are preferring to actually take that into the streetscape. It's how I can do window
The
shopping.
data is telling us that Littleton residents have spent $5.5 million in brick and mortar stores on sporting goods, hobby, musical instrument stores. Right? That's what that's telling us.
Right.
That they didn't spend in Littleton.
They didn't
They spent
spend-
more than 5.5 million
Yeah.
Yeah.
on that stuff, that particular category. But what you're telling us is that they literally traveled to a store and spent $5.5 million on that.
Yeah,
There's no getting around that. Now, that could change in 5 years. If we didn't make no change, that might only be 4.2 because people aren't going to stores and Jeff Bezos has taken over the world.
Right.
That could happen.
Or people don't participate in sports the same
Right,
way. I mean,
exactly,
that's
right.
a
There could be
different
other
question,
factors,
right?
right.
But yeah, these are annual numbers
Right.
for.
And I think the really
2016.
important thing for me, when I keep thinking about it, because those same thoughts are running through my head. This is a model and a snapshot,
Yeah,
right? And this is just for us to help us understand what could happen. It's not what's going to happen. Not just in Littleton, but just in overall economic,
Right.
retail. I mean, there's a lot to think about there. But this just helps us model and take a snapshot to frame our, thought about what we may or may decide not to do as a community.
correct.
Sorry.
And then I had a final comment, and that is in our original tasks with you all as consultants, under the economic analysis, one of the items to be addressed says, what are the benefits and trade-offs of encouraging mixed use? So I think we were definitely getting a sense of that. But the word trade-off, I think, is key, especially as it relates to the different scenarios and the potential in terms of revenue, potential in terms of housing, potential in terms of employees. So I think that that's another big piece of this work is just the ability to see those trade-offs.
I'll put some extra thought into that question too.
Thank you.
Megan,
Okay.
I'm sorry, are you?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
You said final.
Did we get information from the public forum about what the overall preference was as far as the scenarios? What was the overall?
The impression that I got that people seem to gravitate towards scenario 3, but I don't know if that's
Three.
Yeah, it was
that's
pretty.
the stacked
decisive.
version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. When I feel like a lot of, like, probably because I'm a business person, like, I'm always looking at the tax revenue as such a valuable thing for our town, because all of that money can come back and it be
Yeah.
spent here. And that's one of the biggest things that I always said about Littleton, before we had the point, you're spending all of your tax dollars in other towns, and I'd really like to see it here, and I would like to see other towns spending their tax dollars here.
Right.
I feel like that's really valuable to us. So scenario 4 really caught my eye with that huge tax revenue. Was it 727?
The incremental.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
incremental.
so that, and then to me, it makes me feel disappointed in scenario 3, if that's what the town was. So
Yeah.
what do you have to say about that? I'm just curious.
Well, no one has seen this until now.
Okay.
So this wasn't information that was available to folks
No,
at the
but
last.
like just wondering, I mean, it's still, you said it's still good.
You're right.
But this
It's
is
still
not as
incremental,
good.
and so it's still you're still ahead.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was surprising to me too, and I think the reason, I think it's because of the scale, the number of properties. So in
Mm-hmm.
scenario 1 and 2, you know, that sort of maximal development under existing zoning, it's only 6 properties that would be
Mm-hmm. Right.
sort of, you know, but then you jump to 23 properties. So, which is why the assessment jumps. You
Right.
get a big bump, right?
Yeah.
And then you go from 23 to 28, but look how much more intensively those properties are being used. So you're getting an incremental 5, but they're being used much more intensively. So you get this big bump in the assessment. So the assessments, they follow a bit more of a sort of logical pattern of, okay, we're doing more stuff, there's more stuff, there's more stuff. But then that less existing,
Uh-huh.
6, 23, and then 28. So you only have to demo 5 additional properties from scenario 3 to scenario 4 to get that big incremental, like, intensive use.
Yeah,
And so I think that's where you get that big jump.
Yeah.
It's just you have to repurpose only slightly more space and
Right.
then use it so much more
so
intensively.
if
So
you're gonna do scenario 3, might as well just do scenario 4.
you could.
Is that what you're saying?
You got to be careful, though, because there's assumptions on that.
Yeah.
Scenario 4 assumes maximum development and almost full rental and usage.
Yes.
Which may or may not happen. The market might dictate that that's never going to happen.
Right, so what you could do is, because scenario 4, mind you, these are really zoning change scenarios. So you could adopt scenario 4 zoning change, and then let people redevelop at whatever rate they think the market will bear,
Yeah.
right? And so what you're really, I think what really the key takeaway is if you're going to take away an existing tax-paying property, you might as well put something a bit more intensive in its place.
Right.
So I think that's the takeaway from scenario 3 and 4. So you could achieve that on a property by property basis with the scenario 4
Yeah,
zoning.
yeah.
And you might not necessarily achieve the full built out because the market wouldn't bear it, but on a property by property basis, you could have market scenario 4 type structures.
Okay.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that benefit, the full benefit, is only going to get realized over time as the development occurs.
Right.
So, your initial impact in the first 5 years is going to be probably 0. And then you
Right.
start to add properties on and you get some benefit in years 5 through 10. Maybe you get, 75% of it, and then there's a little more incremental development on the tail end, and you add on to it. And you look at all 3 of those numbers, and you look at our town budget, and those are almost meaningless. I mean, our budget is just that big that even adding $700,000 to us isn't going to change, exponentially the delivery of services to us. We're not going to get, that many more teachers or that many more roads paved that faster than we already do.
Because we're talking about what, 30 million?
Yeah,
Something
right?
like that.
Yeah.
The
So,
budget,
Yeah,
46.
yeah.
46, well,
So just to keep that in mind.
Right.
You know, I think that this is, we need to understand this, and this is gonna definitely factor in, but when we think about all of these things, it's the amenities and the quality of life, I think, that we're really debating. It's not necessarily, oh, you know, jackpot.
Right.
I think
You
it's
know?
good that we can see some economic benefit.
Right.
But I think Mike is absolutely right that the real crucial thing is those issues.
And the thing to think about, the 728, to get that, you've got to be willing to let the businesses yank in people from outside of Littleton. Are
That's the
we?
biggest
Are we?
thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know? How much appetite do we as a community have for that in terms of, yes, okay, it gets us an extra $600,000 or $550,000 in taxes, but do I really want to put up with all that for just $550,000? That's not going to get me a whole lot in my life in terms of the delivery on that tax base that I don't already get. You know, we have a good police force, we have good schools, we have decent roads, you know, I mean, it's not the highway
Everything could be
department's fault.
better, but.
Right, you know, but it
not-
won't be a lot better just because we had
Yeah, right.
that extra $500,000 annually. It's not nothing.
I have another question. So you said that in scenarios 1, 2, and 3, I'm trying to wrap my head around how it didn't assume patrons coming from other towns, but scenario 4 requires that.
Yeah.
What if you do scenario 1, 2, and 3, and people from all over love our little common and they come anyway? Is that going to be okay, or? Is
Yeah,
that-
I mean, so yeah, that'd be totally fine. It just means that you'd have to, you know, reserve a spot at the restaurant a week in advance. You know, I mean, that's,
Yeah,
you know, that would
so we
be.
could potentially get that tax
Uh,
revenue or not?
Not that much, no.
Yes, in a sense, yes. If it becomes such a good business spot that the rents go up, right? So if the rents,
Yeah.
you know, if you could get, you know, if the rents went up from say $16 a square foot for a restaurant to $25 a square foot for a restaurant, that's all tax revenue. That all that increases assessed value. So if the businesses can make considerably more money, then the landlords can charge considerably more money,
Right.
which yields more. So the tax revenue is assuming the square footage is filled using the current sort of system rents.
Yeah.
But there's no reason you know, you could have a scenario where you have scenario 3 build out with scenario 4 demand, and thus rents go up through the, you know, climb, and, you know, and so that's all quite possible. That's not what we modeled, but that is an important point, that these numbers are based on everything being filled at system rents, not charging higher rents, which might happen if it becomes a bustling common and if a place that people.
Or the opposite is that we do this while other communities are doing this, and there's so much competition that rents drop. Then you're gonna get even less benefit from a tax
Yeah.
rate point
Right.
of view. You know, it's just, that's why you gotta be careful when you think about it and say, this is a model with assumptions that may or may not be borne out as the market dictates and
Right.
other influences come into play.
Right. I mean, then there's you know, what's going on with construction costs. You know, right now it would be very difficult to build one of these buildings at current rents. The expense wouldn't pencil out because of the boom in Boston and because of low unemployment and all that. Construction labor is super tight. Construction is very expensive, and so if you're going to demo a building, build a 3-story building on top of it, and then charge $14 a square foot or $16 a square foot for rent, like that probably doesn't pencil out. So that's another thing to think about in the future is how are construction costs changing, how are materials costs changing, how are labor costs changing versus what people can charge for rents. Then there's the other question of the higher you move the cap or the zoning cap versus what's available now, the faster you'll get redevelopment. Because the more, which is why, so to say in scenario 1 and 2, there was such little redevelopment because so many properties are already so close to their zonable max, or the max allowed by zoning, that you're not gonna like undertake all the expense to add on the 500 square feet that you're below allowable, it's ridiculous. So, but if you say your zoning is now here and we're gonna bump up to scenario 4 zoning, you might get a lot of scenario 3 type buildings. Doesn't mean that people have to build to the max allowable zoning. You might get a lot of scenario 3 type buildings. But you also might get some scenario 4 type buildings, as, if and when the market allows for it. So that's also another thing to think about, is that just because your zoning is here, people aren't going to build here necessarily.
right.
They can
Yeah.
build somewhere between here and here.
Yeah.
Which brings me to, I decided to step out, to basically come at this from stepping outside,
Okay.
all right? So if I were a developer looking to make my next profit on a
Yeah.
development system, okay? You presented data here about, gaps in supply demand, I'll just put it that way. Among what you, interspersed into what you've got, from your understanding of how the developer concept works, what do we have here that a developer would find, quote, attractive? In other words, in the data, not
Yeah.
necessarily in scenario 3 or 4, which was very nice. They're going to look at, oh, this is a profile of Littleton. What is going to be, you can't predict everything, but let's put it this way. What is commercially, I'll use that word, what is attractive both from a residential development and/or including, we'll call it mixed use, let's just stick to
Yeah.
mixed use.
So I think so obviously the gaps are attractive. Okay, people are verifiably spending this money. I don't have to ask them to spend new money. Maybe I could get them to come to my store that's closer to their house, or closer to, my property that's closer to theirs. But I think, frankly, one of the most attractive things to a developer is that everybody seems to want this to happen. The thing is, if I'm a developer, I frankly don't want to wrestle with committee after committee and the town after, 1,000 town meetings and 1,000 committee meetings just to build a 3-story building. Somebody else is probably going to be more interested in my 3-story building if you're going to make me jump through 1,000,001 hoops, right? So how difficult do you make it for people to actually come and redevelop these properties, I think is going to be a big factor in how successful this ends up being. That it's nice that there seems to be through the master plan and through what people are saying, there seems to be a town willingness for this redevelopment to happen, for people to go participate in the comment. People seem to want this to be a place that they can go to. And so that makes my life as a developer a lot easier. I don't have to convince you to come here. Like, you seem to want to come here. The people seem to want to come and participate in this space. The town seems to want this redevelopment to happen. And so one would hope that the permitting would be a bit easier, that getting a permit to divert traffic for a couple hours as I bring in rebar will be relatively easy to get, that you're not going to make me, have 1,000 and, million problems about this, that, or the other thing. I think the willingness of the town to say, this is something that we have decided that we want, and we acknowledge that just saying we want it is necessary but not sufficient for it to happen. We have a lot of, the planning board has to be on board, zoning has to be on board, permitting has to be on board, the town inspector has to be on board. There's a bunch of other stuff that has to happen in order for the playing field to be attractive. In addition to just, we want this, we will this to happen. So I think those are a lot of things that we're not addressing here that isn't even part of the purview of this committee, but is equally important, if not more important in a lot of ways than some of this stuff. Not to diminish the value of my own work, but I could say that the goose that lays the golden egg is here, but if your drawbridge is 20 feet tall and your moat's a kilometer wide, it doesn't matter that the golden goose is here, So there's that issue. I think that's something that's a bit outside. Do you want to use outside? That's a bit outside of this.
Sure.
That I think is just as important as there's a market, there's a willingness, there's a desire of the community to have this. But what else are we doing to reflect that?
And the other, my final question, because there is a lot here, is I think we've already talked about this, so it's going to be old stuff for you. If you walk around town and ask what is some of the most visible, other than grocery stores and stuff like that, and gasoline stations, what what struck me is the I'll call it, I think Lyle is the one who brought it to my attention, Lyle Webster brought it to my attention, and that is this town has an amazing number for its size of, shall we say, sources for developing, changing, painting, redoing, or basically doing something to your house.
Yeah.
I mean, walk around, and, you can do a kitchen here, a bathroom over there. I mean, you don't even have to leave town to do
Right.
this. Now, this may be strictly an accident, but my question here is there anything valuable? I mean, Lyle's the one who should really pose the question because he spotted this. All
Actually,
right?
I did, but.
What, you did? Okay, I give both of you credit. All right? Well, I'm bringing it up to make sure we get, something out of this. All right, so is it significant enough that we've got here that this could form the nucleus of a revenue generate, not from the view of taxes, but basically bring a theme to town in addition to restaurants and little shops?
Quite possibly. I mean, it's not a business, it's not a market that I'm super familiar with.
Okay.
I don't own a home, and I'm not a DIYer, so,
Well, if you think about Boston
But-
Design Center, where
Right.
they have essentially a one-stop shopping place, but different providers.
I think,
within space.
that's kind of what we talked about. I think that would be an interesting thing for the common. It's not a lumber yard. You're not going to fit that.
No,
You're not going to fit a big showroom of sinks, in the common. But I think a design studio, a sort of a place with a consultative type approach that's also then plugged into local businesses. Hey, here's the thing. You want to redesign a bathroom, or we have architects that we know who are in town. We have some building supply stores we know are in town. We have electricians and plumbers that we know live here.
And restaurants.
And restaurants. While you're waiting for your appointment, you can go over there. Yeah, I definitely think that would be an interesting way to tie that together, especially given that even at a maximally developed scenario 4, this is still going to be a predominantly single-family home town.
Yeah.
The surrounding towns are predominantly single-family home towns. There clearly is, and this being New England, there's a lot of old housing stock. So there's going to be a constant demand for this kind of work. And I could definitely see that being, if I knew anything about this business, I could maybe I'll do it, but I don't know anything about this line of work. I have a desk that's sitting in my house that needs to be finishing, that's just staring at for like 3 weeks. But I do think that, I definitely think that's a reasonable proposition, especially because there's so much of it. And we saw that in the supply gaps. I don't have the data here, but it showed up as in that home improvement, lumber, garden supply. There was a huge oversupply in Littleton of those kinds of things. So people are already used to coming to Littleton for that kind of stuff. You don't really have to convince them to go somewhere different. And I think this is one of those things where, a Chamber of Commerce and business associations also can come into play. If all of these home improvement stores and garden supply and lumber supply and whatever stores said, you know what, we're all going to have like a handout or a sign that refers people to this design center in the common, and we're going to push people there, and then the hopes that people then get pushed back out to places like us when they need things from us. They could help make something like this viable.
So I just want, getting back to the original question, what you're saying is that it's really how Littleton approaches, if it really desires the common to be revitalized, it's got to start taking a close look at all the inadvertent or purposeful barriers that is put up.
Exactly. So, when you have, cluster development is, everybody wants a cluster, right? Because they're so good for your economy. Everybody wishes they had the financial cluster in New York, or the automotive cluster in Detroit, or the tech cluster in, the Silicon Valley, or the steel cluster that was in Pittsburgh, or whatever. These things, one wonders, well, I guess not one wonders, I think is overly generous to most people. But I think if you stop and think about it for a minute, you would think, well, why are the 3 main U.S. car manufacturers next door neighbors in the same town? Aren't they like cutthroat competitors? Why is every major U.S. bank on the same street in the same city? And the reason being is that they are export-oriented businesses, And so by clustering, they get access to specialized labor, specialized inputs, specialized services. Everybody's more productive, and everything is more efficient, and they are all more competitive by clustering. The problem is that a lot of clusters, it's hard to purposefully create a cluster. You know, Pittsburgh became steel town because of the confluence of 3 navigable rivers. It's close to the coal and coke supplies of Virginia, or of West Virginia, and the ore mines of Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania and so on. You know, Silicon Valley started because one guy went there and he was a huge ass and nobody liked working for him. So he drew all the best engineers to work for him, but people only tolerate working for him for about a year, and they would leave. And they started their own companies. So you got one brilliant but ornery guy sort of was responsible. You can't like plan that, right? I mean, it's hard to say. And then Stanford ended up becoming a thing, and it sort of fed in on each other. But the root of it was just some ornery guy that nobody liked working for. You know, and so it's hard to artificially create them or to will them into existence. So if you find something that you already seem to be excelling at, it's easier to nurture that than to say, we would like to be the cluster for something that has no presence here already. You know, so that's a roundabout way of coming back to the point of, if you have something that already seems to be working, you're probably better off nurturing that than trying to do something.
So what the town really could do, though, and it makes practical sense, is back to your first theme,
Yeah.
which is reduce the barriers, make it less complicated, make it as attractive as possible for developers, basically investors to come in and basically be innovative.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's a relationship, right? You know, you can unrequited love only lasts so long. Like they can, you know, one party can only chase for so long before you get tired, right? So, you know, if you make it too hard to fall in love, then they'll go somewhere else. And similarly, you know, you guys want to make sure you look out for your own interests, and you don't want to get completely, you know, you don't want things that you don't want. But if the town decides we have decided the things that we want, you know, you should make it easy to get the things that you want. You know, if you have zoning that you're happy with, and if you have land use that you're happy with, and so on, then, you know, then it would behoove you to make it easy for those things to happen within the parameters that you have decided are appropriate.
Any other questions this evening?
I'll go one more time. And I'll try to tee it up efficiently because
Okay.
it may well be outside of our parameters, but I don't know any better. It's only my
I
second.
already talked about
time
this
here.
guy in Stanford, so I mean, that's.
I would tend to think that the further we get towards scenario 4, and as big as that is, we're pretty well necessitating that we have to get a sewer to have them.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think scenario 3 and 4 would
Yes.
both very much require a sewer.
Thank you. Just
Yeah.
wanted to have
Yeah.
that firmly lodged.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I have picked up from living in this town through the past year is hotels really create a whole bunch of tax income. So
Bed tags and, yeah.
is that out of the parameters of what we're talking about? Maybe not a hotel, but maybe an inn. There's the Colonial Inn in Concord. Is that something that we would look to encourage in the common?
I mean, it could very well fit within these building parameters. It's not a use that we specifically examined, but it could very well fit within these building parameters. And it's not something that you're gonna have multiple of anyway, so if it is something that you want, and you do 1 or 2 of them would be,
Well,
you know, would be
That would
sufficient.
definitely
Actually,
help
have
with
one or two of
scenario
them now.
4, because it would bring people from the outside to stay there to then
Yeah.
spend their money here.
Right.
But we have the Littleton Inn and we have the Marriott now.
That's right. Drove by that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, when you were looking at this, I know you made reference to the point, okay, which is a quintessential kind of cluster. It's a peculiar selection of retail and other stuff. In a certain sense, it's unusual if you
Yeah.
compare them to others, okay? And so what you're describing for the town to be looking at is that we not only want to make this sort of our common sort of Littletons as opposed, but I've heard nothing from you that would even begin to suggest that the point in its current, guise would make our job easier or harder.
Yes, that is true. I have not said anything about that. I don't think it would make it. I don't necessarily think it would make it easier. It might make it slightly harder, in the sense that if you're thinking, there's already a couple of restaurants and stuff up there. They are obviously of a very different scale than what you would have. I mean, they're huge, right? That's not the kind of stuff that you would be having in the common. So,
Well,
you
some
know-
of the restaurants are huge, some of them aren't. I
well,
mean,
that's
they-
true. Yeah.
They have a variety.
So the question is, if you're talking more a place with a couple dozen tables, in the common, is that really competing necessarily with something that's at the point? I don't know. I mean, they're competing for the same dollars in a sense, for the same mouths. But I think it's one of those things of people who want that kind of quiet, sort of sit-down restaurant, they might just be going to a similar quiet sit-down restaurant somewhere else, like in Acton, say. And instead, they're just gonna do that here. So, it's the big, you have those meals where I want to go to the loud restaurant with just TVs, or I want to go to the quiet restaurant which doesn't have TVs. And I don't think they necessarily, they're two different services in my book. So, I've thought about it, and you can, I think my struggle is apparent in the way I'm trying to, I've struggled with this question myself, like, does it help, does it hurt? I can, if I was the lawyer, I could argue either case, I think, pretty successfully.
Does the supply gap numbers you show incorporate the point spending?
The supply gap numbers are as of 2016, so it would include some, for sure, yeah.
So that answers your question?
Yes, it does, yeah.
On a more quantifiable basis. I mean, we can
Yeah.
argue what people like to do,
Yep.
Right.
but the point is that even with the point on there, we are still spending money outside of Littleton.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, and yes, and I think, I think that would be, that the common would be a place to get people to and from work, I think would be, so I think a lot of that could be, I buy a coffee on my way to the office, or I go out for a beer after work with, and people don't work in Littleton, right? They work somewhere else, and so, if you could get some of that coming and going traffic, or the commuters, I can't remember who pointed that out about, we could get somebody stopped a little bit closer to home and get them in the common. I don't think anybody says we don't want anybody who doesn't live, we're not gonna check IDs at the door and say, if you don't live in Littleton, you can't come here. But the way I tried to frame this was, suppose you don't get anybody to come here, in the sense of the scale and the feasibility, does it make sense? And the more the merrier, but does it at least make sense?
Okay, we don't want to keep chewing up
Yeah.
your time here. You said that you wanted to discuss one other item? Is that
Yeah, so
correct?
I have.
This is of significance.
Economic impact stuff. So, as you may recall from our proposal and from our proposal interview, I talked a little bit about the difficulties of doing economic impact analysis for towns. And that's not unique to Littleton. The economic impact models that are available, of which there are basically two, they are all county-based. They work best at the county level. So obviously, Littleton is one town in a large county. The secondary problem is Littleton is a border community in between two large counties. So when you're talking about the way that the ripple effects, the term is leak, so leak out of the area through commuting, import, savings, and taxes, it's leaking west and east. So it's leaking into Worcester County, and it's leaking elsewhere into Middlesex County, and into Suffolk County, and so on. So even if you just get, say, a Middlesex County model, you're missing all the stuff that goes westward into Worcester County, and vice versa. And so there is that difficulty of the size of Littleton, the sort of existing constraints of economic impact models, and the geographies that make all of this a bit difficult to do. Well, to rephrase, it makes it hard to measure the ripple effects of economic activity in Littleton on Littleton. The models would do a great job figuring out the ripple effects of things happening in Littleton on Middlesex County, or on Worcester County, or on the state of Massachusetts as a whole. That's not problematic at all. The software is very good at that. It's how does these changes multiply inside Littleton would be difficult to do with existing tools. There is ways around it. The in-plan model, for example, does zip code level analysis, so you could do a model of 01460 and say, that's what we're going to do. Out of necessity, it has fewer capabilities. The model is not as robust, but it is doable, and it would provide a sense of what the ripple effects are, the multiplier effects are within Littleton, of changes happening within Littleton. But again, there's a trade-off between the capability of the model and the precision of the model. So one of the things that I thought would be useful to think about is, who are you doing this economic impact analysis for? Because I think for the town's purposes, these direct changes that we've discussed could be sufficient. There's going to be this many jobs, this much tax revenue, this much wages, this many people, they're paying this much rent happening in Littleton. The ripple, there might be some effects of that, that one of the workers who works at this new restaurant then goes and buys coffee at the coffee shop, so that creates a fraction of a new job, and then you multiply that by 20 people, you might get one additional job here and there. So not to say that there isn't some multiplicative effect inside Littleton, but I think it'll be small because of the commuting patterns, because of imports, because of savings and taxation and all that. But that's not to say that your state grant might not benefit from reporting at larger regions, or even state reporting. To say this is how the impacts of Littleton multiply across the state, because it doesn't matter, the state is far larger than Littleton. The models can handle that just fine. So that's what I wanted you guys to think about. We have everything geared up. The inputs to the model is basically that summary table I already showed you, the jobs, the wages, the revenues. That's all. We just got to put that in something. So that's all kind of ready to go. The question is, do we get a more limited model and do something just for the zip code, or do we use some of the models that we already have and do something statewide that that'd be more useful to you for some reporting purposes? That's really the question that I have. How you want us to tackle this question. I hope that this summary here is, I don't know if I'm going to get an answer today, so I hope that this is summary enough to keep these points in your mind as you think about this question. But that's basically the decision that is kind of in front of you, is how do you want to tackle this?
Would it be possible to get maybe just an example of what an in-plan model could provide a community versus
Sure.
what the traditional county level view is?
What it would provide would be exactly the same. So the in-plan, what it provides, it doesn't change based on the size of the geography. The precision at
Okay.
which it does that differs.
So it's the confidence of what
So
you're
it would give
getting.
you
Okay.
basically jobs, income, revenues, and value added. It gives you those four measures no matter what your geography is. It's just the precision by which it does it and the things in which it considers in that calculation.
Okay.
From the
Well, that's
Commonwealth, from the Commonwealth's point of view, because they go up at least 10,000 feet on occasion,
Mhm.
all right? So they might want to know, or you would think they might want to know, if Littleton does X at some scale Y,
Yep.
does it have any effect at all outside of Littleton? In other words, we almost have to do almost both, and I'm a little concerned about just,
Yeah.
so I'll,
The question is, really it's the inside Littleton part that I think is more the question. We have everything. We have existing models that we can use for state level analysis, for
Right.
example. And so we could say, this change happens inside Littleton, that change in Littleton causes this effect
Outside.
outside.
But
The question is there a desire to know how the changes inside Littleton might create additional effects inside Littleton?
I got you, okay.
And that's something we'd have to get a zip code level implant model to do, and with the limitations that are inherent in that choice. It would provide you an answer with some margin of error, and which, again, any model would do, right? What I was told in school is that every model is wrong and some are useful, right? So the question is, would this be useful? So, we have a finite amount of money to throw at modeling. So the question is,
I think you have to think about, would it be useful because the model has limitations, but also, would it be material?
right,
Because we're such a small footprint that even if the model were perfect,
yeah.
would it be material?
Right. So if you're talking, multiplier effects on sort of county level models are maybe 1.5. So if you have a scenario with 500 jobs, your total impact might be 750. So you get an incremental, say 250, right? And that's at county level where there's less leakage than there is at a town. But that's probably that's probably the best you could hope for in a analysis of Littleton and effects on Littleton, would be maybe a 1.2, maybe a 1.5 level multiplier. So the question is, at the expense of doing something larger, would knowing that our 500 jobs might give us another 150 jobs,
Gonna change our decision
is that going to change your decision making any? And it might be worth it if having a state level analysis is of no use to you. If that's not of use to you, you might as well do the other one. But if
Or you could do neither.
or you could do neither. Save us a little bit of hours, but that's really about the extent of it. But the expenditure on hours is not a lot because we've already found our inputs. So it's. And
But you have to do anyway.
as a money-saving move, it's really not going to make you any.
Right.
It's not going to make any difference. So the question is really more, which of these analyses are more useful to you, and we might be able to get creative with it and do sort of both, but really, I think in order to focus the mind, I don't really want to present it as a both because that might not be possible. And so if I later come back and say, actually, I figured out a way to do both, then that would be welcome news. But at least, I think it's important to think about it in terms of.
If I understand you correctly, let's assume we decide to just do the best we can with little we can with inside Littleton, the effect of all this inside Littleton, and we go away, and then 2 years from now or 6 months from now, we're going for money from the Commonwealth, and we want to make a case that so we just come back to you and said, plug the numbers into this model.
Yeah.
You have them,
Right.
so it costs us bucks to do it, but
Yeah, it would cost you hours, and that's really it. We have the software, so.
yeah. What I'm saying is that you're sort of like we can have the best of both worlds. It's just a matter of choosing which one we want to go with first, if any. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and I don't. You know where to find me if you need me to go over this again. I mean, I understand that this is something I've been doing for 10 years, not everybody else. So, in terms of what does each model do, what can we get, what are the limitations, explain this to me again. I'm more than happy to answer that question as many times as it takes. So I've tried to explain to my friends what I do, and they don't. They've given up at this point. So, I wish I could say I'm an architect. People understand architect. But that's kind of the decision that I have put in front of you.
Okay. Well, we'll have to have a just further work on this by the committee.
Yeah, we can hear you sort of.
Hi.
Hello. Can't hear you now.
Can they hear us?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, this is Mark from Donahue. One thing I just want to offer in that conversation, in which I think Ronnie explained it well, but is, when it comes to the economic impact, I see two core reasons why folks may want to do that part of the analysis. The one is from a marketing perspective of highlighting what the impacts of certain kind of investments or your activity or your industry or your business or whatever might be, and that could be something that folks use for promoting what they're doing. A second is for a decision on a policy. So saying one investment is more fruitful than another. So to get back to the point that was being made before, is this material? I think that might be a big part of this, is that if there are policy decisions that be driven by an impact analysis, and if there isn't a marketing angle that may be taken from an impact analysis, then I don't know if it would make a material difference to what we're doing. It probably gets more to what Ron is saying on the job creation side and the tax generation side, which is much more direct. Anyway, that's my 2 cents of it, and I don't feel like we touched on those two, at least in my mind, those two core ways we end up using this kind of analysis in our own work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. Actually, that's I've been deep enough in this part of the analysis where I've forgot that part. That's actually a useful case.
Thanks a lot,
That,
Mark. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's that communication with outside audiences where
Yeah.
this kind of stuff is useful. So, it's so again, I'm as many times as you need to talk about this, I will talk about it.
Is there anything else we have for Rod? Have we tortured it enough? Okay.
I had a good time. This is pretty good. It's better
Thank
than
you, Rod.
testifying to legislatures.
Yeah.
Those guys are mean.
And unfriendly.
Yeah, let's see. I quickly learned after a couple times of doing legislative testimony is that they really weren't talking to me. I just had to sit there and go, sir, yes, okay. And they were really just talking to whoever was voting for them.
Okay.
Where's my mouse? Oh, it's over there. Yeah, there it is.
So did you drive here tonight?
I did.
All right.
So
you
your
have to worry about a
adventure is-
train.
No, yeah, there's no trains in Western Mass.
Okay, I think all of you have seen the copy of the roadmap or plan. Is that the case? Did everyone have? Does everyone have a copy of that?
Any more copies?
Yes, it's all right.
Oh, well, the ones that are thanks.
Sorry. You read one?
Thanks, Rod.
No problem.
Thank you.
All right, so what this is for, oh, you got one? Okay, okay. What this is for really is a request to us from the consultants, if I have it, I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. They feel that that we should be offering up some sort of roadmap, I call it a roadmap or plan, of what the town should be doing to get to the revitalization. And if you look at the list of the items that are on here, we're somewhere between 3 and 4, we're getting very close to 4. And it's number 5 that would take us into the, shall we say, when we start involving many other committees with different, shall we say, priorities or priorities that may not mesh with what we're trying to do here all the time. Okay, so what we're interested here is, does this skeletal outline contain the necessary elements to present to the town if we, as it were, fill them up, or they've got basically had some substance to them? Would something like this, put together, be useful for the town? I'm talking about the Board of Selectmen, the Planning Board, everyone else, including, and more importantly, the residents, to see what the recommended roadmap, because here is where we're going to be suggesting zoning and regulations, which are the mechanism that opens the door, hopefully, to investors and others, or private property owners who bring the comment to start acting in response to it, to the to any zoning changes that we suggest, or are suggested to us. So, is this outline a reasonable start, or do you feel it's too detailed? Do you have a comment? Anyone here have a comment about it? Have you had a chance, A, to consider it? Maybe you didn't know the context, but this is the beginning of, as it were, presenting to the town the pathway that we think is important to follow to get to revitalization. Please.
If we could just draw on the results of the master plan and being able to have that plan in our hands and, especially going to the implementation table and saying, okay, these are the steps, and we can check one thing off and what's next, go back and remind ourselves. Just having that plan, I'm really looking forward to that part of it, the exact details of what's in it.
Yeah, I know, this, to me, we're very close to getting some good feedback about item number 4, and that launches us immediately, and I think number 5 is really the meat and potatoes of the roadmap.
Right.
If you add in, I mean, we put together this plus the economic analysis that we just heard about tonight. I think those two elements answer.
I'm only trying to be partially facetious here, but is this a trick question?
No.
I mean, obviously, we gotta have, what's I assume there was a deliverable from going through this process.
There is a deliverable, but this is I'm introducing this for the first time to make sure
Right.
that we're on it and thinking about it.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure this outline,
I think this outline is a good jumping off point.
that's.
This would be the outline for the deliverable, I would.
Yes,
Right.
that's it.
I would
And
say.
I emphasize jumping off point, because as we get the actual documentation from Fort Point, then it will be a committee process to
Agreed.
present that to the town. And I use the town in a global sense, thinking, the community, but also the boards you were talking about, and committees. But I think that's gonna be a lot of work, and it's gonna be iterative, and it's going to require flexibility on our part. As we go through it, we'll have good ideas, or we'll have what we think is a good idea and realize only after we try to work it, that's a terrible idea, that won't work. Let's do this instead.
This is mainly a shot across our bow I was
Yes.
trying to get. That we got to start thinking about it and start filling in, see what the fill-ins are going to look like.
Yep.
Okay, is there anyone who disagrees with what Mike just presented? Because this is the start point. Okay, Megan, you all set?
I'm fine. Yeah, could you just remind me, did you say the selectmen gave this to you, or did you write this?
No, this is from Fort Point.
Oh, from Fort Point, okay.
This is strictly from, yeah, this is,
Okay, yeah.
this is their suggested, and to me, it was, perfectly straightforward.
Suggesting
Yeah.
of what they're gonna be doing and
Yeah, I mean, this is
Yeah.
just an outline.
outline of what they will be
Yeah.
presenting.
The only caveat I would throw out immediately is preferred scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that whatever we deliver has to have flexibility in it. So it can't be throwing all our eggs into one basket saying, do this or do nothing. It's gotta be, well, you could do this, but this is the range of things you could do.
I think we got meat.
Exactly.
Tonight,
Right.
some meat for those
Correct.
potatoes, as it
Right.
were, to do it.
Right. I think that's the way we've been working,
Yes.
so, but we already started saying, well, 3 with a blend of 4.
Yeah.
1 and 2 sounds like everybody, even at the public input session, they're like, what, that just
Yeah.
leaves it the same, okay.
Right.
Which ultimately, the town may decide that's what's gonna happen for different
Yes.
reasons.
Yeah.
But I think, that blend and having enough flexibility so that, because, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, nothing we write down today is going to exactly happen in 10 years, there's no
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, I mean, I have no difficulty changing number
Right.
4 when we come to that point. That-
Scenarios,
yeah,
or, I
options
would say
for the town.
scenarios, but
Yeah.
the way we present it has that flexibility.
Yeah.
But clearly, we do want to give some leadership,
Yes,
some direction.
right. It has to
Because
have-
I think the point was the
Right.
master plan indicated
Right.
that everybody wanted something done, but they weren't quite sure what
Right.
it was.
Correct.
And we don't want to come back again and say, well, we want something done, but we're not sure what it is. I think we
No,
want
this,
to, we want to go
this
forward.
gives us the something that we
Right.
want to do.
Yeah.
It's just, I think what Mike is referring to is the bandwidth of it.
Yeah,
Correct.
okay.
Okay,
Right.
I'm very happy with that.
It's gotta have direction for sure,
good.
definitive direction.
very good. Okay. So, Do we have any further information about input from the community that came from the last workshop, further than what we had immediately afterwards? For example, nothing's come up from Fort Point from the Survey Monkey,
Right.
how to your desk, anything?
No.
Does anyone here on the committee, have you heard anything on the, I'll use this word advisedly, on the street from more than one person to get a flavor of, or nothing, dead silence? There's something in between. Sorry.
Summertime.
Okay.
Well, in terms of the online responses, did we get anything worth reporting out on?
Well, we don't have the results of the Survey Monkey
Yeah.
Oh.
survey yet. We know that when it went out on Facebook and Twitter, when Anthony cross-posted all of that for us, it really helped, got quite a few hits. So there's just over 100 responses to the
Great.
survey.
So we haven't analyzed the.
Someone from Fort Point on that can answer when we'll see those
Are you still on the
responses?
phone? Hello?
Nope.
No,
Okay.
as soon as Rod took off, they,
Oh.
oh, there.
They're there. Hi.
Have you done any further work on the Survey Monkey results? Maybe they can't hear me. That's
We'll ask tomorrow.
We'll ask.
Did you hear that? I think that was for you.
okay.
Moving on.
We can get back to that. Okay,
Okay.
that's not worth, okay. All right, let me move on to item number 2, form-based code. I tried in my communications to make clear why we're looking at this, why we in particular as a committee are looking at this.
This is Emma. Julie had to grab a train home.
That's fine. And,
Hi, it's Emma. Can you hear me?
Yes. That's fine.
yeah,
Yes, we are going through them now.
You just let her know that she can get back
we,
to us tomorrow.
we can catch up on this later, tomorrow or on Monday. Okay. Maybe she'll interrupt again. Who knows? All right, form-based code. All right. There are many different ways we can approach this. I don't expect a decision tonight, unless all of you have read the data, the information, have come to the conclusion one way or another. Has anyone reached a conclusion, as it were? Is this something that we should recommend to the planning board and others? A, that this is something that is worth using, and B, if this is the case, you need to know that there's been a budget submitted by Fort Point where they would include this in a sub to basically do the work. This would be in addition to what we already have contracted in terms of dollars and time. And that figure is about $35,000. So I would prefer, personally, if the timing worked out for us, I would prefer whatever we ask the town for, that we aggressively pursue outside funds as well. And there was one particular, Maren did some gallant homework for us.
Yeah, the EEA grant, state planning assistance grant that we are doing some of this work under, they're going out for another round probably in February, and form-based code would certainly qualify for it. But again, it would be competitive application in February, so, probably late spring before it would be awarded.
So, at a recent joint meeting with the Board of Selectmen, the Finance Committee, and the School Committee, they were talking about $25,000 potentially. That was for this, right? I thought it was
That's correct, yeah.
form-based.
Yeah.
So that is in existing funding that the town had allocated for another purpose that wasn't required. So it's not going to require an assessment or use of funds in the future, that this money is sitting there waiting to be used for some purpose. So then we're talking conceivably $10,000 towards the grant.
Whatever
right? That would be
we-
the delta.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be the idea.
Right, and the reason that the selectmen were talking about it was because to use it for a different purpose would require a vote at fall town meeting, so it would go on the warrant along with several other things of the same ilk, using existing money that wasn't going to be spent otherwise, it would just be released to free cash. So this is one of those things. I looked at it, I think that, I think it's a good idea in the sense that I think it would help the community if they could understand that these are the types, or, whatever the planning board, which I think would be the driver ultimately, right? Because it's required, these are zoning, this would be zoning
Right.
bylaws. I think that if the community could understand that if we developed the common, it would be within these parameters, so you wouldn't see a high-rise, you wouldn't see one facade looking like this and another facade looking like this. That it would be somewhat uniform, definitely a range of choices, but a finite range of choices. I think it would go a long way towards helping the community envision what could happen in the common, not what would happen, but what could happen. And I think that assuaging those concerns and anxieties is always a good idea when you're trying to get people to buy in on something like this. Having said that, I would be very curious as to what the planning board's appetite was for something like this. Because if they were like just not ready or didn't want to think about it, we'd be wasting our time. I wouldn't say money necessarily, but the timing might not be right. So I would like some feedback from the planning board before we committed as a community to spending this kind of money.
Well, all that's happened so far with respect to the planning board, and Anna can report and sort of summarize it, but I made a very brief presentation about this to the planning board. They were provided information in advance about it. My distinct impression is that they wanted to, as it were, think about it. I think there's a learning curve to understand it, because this is, from certain perspectives, a different way of looking at how to regulate how space gets used.
I mean, the other thing to think about is that if we can't get the zoning changes that we're asking for to support a scenario 3 or 4, then do we really need form-based code? I mean, you could have it without it. You could still require any new development to meet form-based, but would we really care as much as a community?
If we had form-based,
No, would we care as much about form-based code to find, if we can't get the zoning changes supported by town meeting? Like, if we want scenario 3, we have to get zoning changes approved by town meeting, correct?
Well,
Zoning bylaw changes?
Right, but this
Yeah.
is a type of zoning bylaw change where you can make sure that the vision.
Yeah,
that
I
the people
understand that.
want
But
are
if you
in
don't
place.
get the square footage, setbacks, parking requirements, all that
I think
through.
doesn't this replace those
Yes.
kind of
Right.
requirements?
Yeah, generally these are blended. Generally, these are blended.
Yes, I get, okay.
They're generally blended I can't say Massachusetts, because the number of towns in Massachusetts doing this is
Small so far, but
small so far. The state, in order to offset the effects of sprawl, are very interested in implementing this. And this is one of the reasons why we became interested in, because it's a tool to avoid what we'll call the clutter boxing effect. It's a set of regulations designed to provide something that is to scale and avoids the other kinds of development we've seen in the town that don't reflect what the town really would like to have in terms of what it sees and what it walks around.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because I think for too long, I mean, zoning was adopted for certain purposes. I mean, mostly to keep slaughter yards away from housing developments. And over the century and some that zoning has been used, it's been sort of shoved into kind of boxes where it really doesn't belong. And I think in regard to the area around the common, that's a very good instance of that. We're not, in the common, we're not worried about having slaughterhouses there. What we're worried about is the way it's going to look and the way people are going to experience it. And I think this form-based zoning really goes to that, and so I'm rather enthusiastic about the idea, and I hope that we could at least sort of, consider it further. Of course, it is something that the planning board, it's gonna be a very different thing for them and for Roland and all those other people, but I think, I hope that we could look into this very closely.
The other evening, we really didn't have a chance to go into it
Sure.
in greater detail, but given the fact that that the members that were present that evening don't have experience with form-based
Of course.
coding, it's something that would need to be learned about quite a bit
Sure.
more before I think people feel comfortable about it.
Yeah, let's clarify for a second. This is not going to replace the zoning bylaw suggestions made by 4 Point to support the ability to change the use. It's going to go along with it, correct? I'm talking about the setbacks, the parking ratios, the floor-to-area ratio that we talked about at the those aren't all going out the window.
No.
No, they would be, this would support that.
Well, it would exist with it.
Yes,
because
I get that.
They would exist with it, because
Right.
what you just described is what we're using right now. It's called Euclidean, and it tells you how far, how close.
Correct,
how far.
I read that and I get that.
Okay.
So this would help us tie the pieces together, lots
Correct.
together, traffic flow, landscaping, facades. I got that.
Right, and the public
Yes.
realm facilities with.
Correct. The problem I have with it, hearing Anna talk, is that if we put all this together, it's thumbs up or thumbs down on the plan. And I'm concerned that if we make it too complex and throw too much out there all at the same time, it's gonna go thumbs down and we're gonna lose the baby with the bathwater. That's why I asked if the planning board, like what their appetite is. If their appetite is tentative, then I would say that we need to do more homework and get them on board. And if we can't, then I say, we don't worry about it for the moment, don't give up,
Right.
but we just go forward with what we had already defined. Don't move the goalposts, leave them where they are. And I am supportive of it as well. I think it's a great idea, personally. But ultimately, we're not going to execute on any of this. We're going to hand it off to the zoning board, the planning board, the zoning board, and the board of selectmen. So I just want to make sure that we understand what the ramifications are
Well,
and don't.
No, I agree with those.
This is interesting, because you're right in the sense that,
This is Karen at UCL. I'd like to add something if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing the conversation, but I just wanted to point out that one of the advantages of the form-based code, I agree, it's supplemental to zoning and it supports it. But I think, the inclusion of illustrations and visualizations of the code actually makes it more accessible. So that's actually one of the advantages. So I don't think it necessarily complicates the space zoning more, having this in place. It's actually an easier toolkit for developers to understand and property owners to understand because it's supplemented by illustration. That's one of the key ways you're able to regulate with form-based code.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I was about to say that my understanding of how we're working with this, and this is apropos of your point, is that it's going to fall to the Fort Point folks doing the drafting for the zoning regardless of which, shall we say, approach we use. It's going to be coming from, as you were, us, that is Fort Point and this committee, going to be given in turn to the planning board for them to accept, fine-tune, whatever they're going to do. They're not going to be actually, I heard nothing from them to indicate that they were interested at all in undertaking the assignment from scratch, as it were, from the very beginning. And it'll fall to us, as it were, to oversee and follow up with Fort Point how this is going. They're going to work with the planning board, show them what's going on, but the ultimate responsibility for the package is ours.
I very much appreciate Mike's intra-board knowledge. I don't know anything about that, so thank you. I appreciate the enthusiasm, which I will add and echo, because my contributions in June were, if you don't change zoning, nothing's gonna change. So that's why 1 and 2 don't change much. So we need this if we're going to have any master plan change to what happens in Littleton.
Interesting. Megan?
Well, from what I've read today, the first time I've ever heard about this, and just had a little bit of discussion about it with people that have knowledge on it, I'm leaning towards it. I think it's a good thing, and it sounds like it's gonna simplify things, so I'm leaning towards supporting it, but I'm not ready to make a decision for sure, without having a little bit more discussion with people that know about it. So I wanna just do a little bit more personal research.
Okay. Anna, do you want to add anything?
Nope. Okay,
Right.
thanks.
I'd like to suggest, I hate to have a bureaucratic suggestion here, but it's the only way somebody on our, folks on our committee are going to have to pick up the ball on this. Not, become familiar with it, and to the extent that you can, come to what we'll call a sensible recommendation based on what you learn about it. And rather having roundtable discussions about it, I'm thinking of having, and this is just arbitrary, 2 folks. I like your skepticism, that's going to be healthy. Okay? And I'd also like some professionalism, someone who has some, well, that's not going to work. That's you, Lyle. Okay, so I'm proposing this. It can be rejected because I want you to be enthusiastic participants in opening the door to see if form-based code makes sense for us in context. And if you want to add a third, Mike, are you interested in putting your wheel in this?
No, I mean, I support it. I'm not that worried about it from a, is it a good idea? I think we all agree it's a good idea. I'm more concerned about the deliverable and the complexity and making sure that we have support and buy-in of what we're presenting.
Okay. I'm turning to you for, since your sensitivity to this and experience with this may be, shall we say, greater than the other 2, okay, slightly. I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to be the third wheel in this.
Well, at that point, you have a quorum, correct?
Well, this would be a
Three,
task
seven.
group, right? Or no, we can't do it?
Not with three.
With 3, you can,
3 we could?
yeah.
Without running into...
Three isn't a quorum.
Right.
I mean, it's not, you're not gonna be making the decision. It's your expertise that results from your work that's gonna inform the rest of us. And I just wanna have as many...
Yes, I will help out.
Okay. So Lyle, Mike, and Megan will undertake that. And I will ask Maren to continue to supply websites and maybe even, thicker tomes, as it were, and any sketches and images that we can find.
Yeah, it was very helpful going to those websites, because I knew nothing, I never heard about it before,
Right.
and I
So-
felt I really knew something after I'd gone to a few of those
So the output would this
websites.
would be, you're gonna become familiar enough with form-based code that you can talk about it easily, present it if necessary. Okay. Put together a story that we can present to all the relevant boards. And handle it in such a way that we don't have all our eggs in one basket, as Mike pointed out. So that means looking at putting the 2 together. I would just point out that the only reason, just to repeat, the reason we're looking at this is because of the feedback that we've got from the public about their expectations for the comment. This is not just an idea, okay? So we're under obligation, it doesn't make sense. All right, work schedule, time required. I'd like to have some feedback. You guys all know your individual schedules and everything else going on in your life in addition to this committee, so do you need more than 2 weeks to do this?
No, I don't think so. I just want to talk to a couple people I know that probably know about this.
Lyle?
I barely said yes to being on this board, and the concept of doing anything else in my life is something I should probably be taken out and flogged for. So,
All right, tell you what, Mike, can you feel you could, as it were, make some headway in the next 2 weeks?
Sure.
All right.
Don't see why not.
I'm happy to be contributing. To
Yeah.
think I'm leading anything, I would be leading you astray,
Okay.
so.
Okay. I don't, okay. The formulation of the questions, or the, shall we say, the issues that you want to attack probably will straighten, and you can do this by email, you don't have to get together in a room to do this.
Okay.
And we just need a point person instead of having to do 3 emails. So who would like to be the
Mike,
person?
we can figure it out.
You can figure it
The
out?
3 of us can figure it out.
Okay. I hope so. Okay,
Yep.
this is good stuff. And then we're only gonna do the comment once. I wanna make it,
Yeah.
regardless of how we do it, I wanna make it right. Okay. All right, Chase is not here. I'm moving on to the update on Sewer Task Force progress. Chase is not here. There's been lots of developments, and the biggest, the largest one is that it's still, the issue of financing it is still a major barrier, a major hurdle, because of the size of the amount of money required, somewhere in the vicinity of 26 million. And basically becoming far more assured about how various property owners in the common are actually going to participate and actually hook up to it, which determines how the financing gets done. So the committee has done, and I just sit in, the committee, the task force has come up with a brochure that has all the facts on it that they're using both for the town and for property owners to be reinforced about their understanding about what's going on with the common, with the sewering. We've gotten a lot of help from the Littleton Business Association in establishing a kind of working partnership between the owners of property in the common and the sewering task force. So they're not just now getting around to speaking to each other. This conversation's been going on for a while. So I'll leave it like that, and I'll let Chase at another meeting catch up, and probably he'll have lots more. But in any event, one other thing that I think the committee should be aware of is that the engineers working on who would be working on the design for, and the build-out for the sewering have been informed and kept up to date with respect to the kinds of output of water that the common will generate, given the scenarios, the options that we've talked about. So the important question is capacity, which determines how the technology gets implemented. So there's been a connection between what we're doing and what the sewering task force is doing. Okay, so the next public workshop is scheduled for October the 11th. And we're going to try to hold to that.
Here, again, location.
Well,
We don't know yet.
you're
And-
looking for your suggestions, I guess.
Please.
Was this a comfortable spot? I mean,
Yeah.
we've kind of had it maxed out for a number of people, but,
Well,
This
it's
one-
also the style. What are we going to do this time? What are we after this time?
well, my impression was that Julie would recommend the drop-in style this time, where you stay for, you have several stations and somebody can come in according to their time schedule. It wouldn't require them to be right at the beginning and stay through 2 hours if they didn't have 2 hours to give to the process.
Any comments? As this is our plan, because this is a crucial,
That sounds good, and then at this point, there'll be a more developed scenario or set of scenarios?
At this point, I'm not exactly sure what questions the consultants need to have answered and what information will be presented. We'll flesh that out over the next couple of weeks. But
I think that if we can tonight, at least, whatever we're going to be asking the public, it's going to, the spectrum of the scenarios will have with it then some of the data that we've heard tonight. It'll basically be the outline of the roadmap. Not the whole thing.
Well, I would hope not.
No, it would be basically two parts, I'm going to suggest. One would be, this is the type of, shall we say, comment that we're going to have. And this is what we need to do, or we should be doing to get there.
So it'll be kind of like 4 and 5 on this?
Yeah, it's pretty close to it. What is it? Why are we doing it? What's the upside? What's the downside?
Well, and to what end?
Yeah, to what end? Yeah. I mean, what?
No, I mean, and to what end? I mean, from the standpoint of once we get done with that, so what do we then, what's the next step to?
The next step,
moving forward after that?
we can basically, as it were, we can justify, if the plan is well composed, we can justify this as a viable roadmap to interested responsible committees. And number two, it further strengthens, to the extent it gets strengthened, of what the town is really interested in. And by voting the necessary changes in zoning, that's the support that we're after.
Well, right, and then the results of this workshop will help Fort Point know how to draft the
That's-
zoning
yes.
bylaw changes
Yeah.
that we're looking for.
So based on what you said, then you don't foresee them starting anything related to zoning till after this workshop?
Well, they've had to do some to get to this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the
bulk of
the bulk of it?
Well, if you look at the setback, I mean, it's very ironic if you look at the specs that were put up in this as a scenario, and you have the changes are already laid out
Yeah.
in Euclidean format. In fact, it's typical, that's as far as zoning goes.
Correct.
So it's already, quote, done.
Except for putting it on paper.
Yes.
Right.
And that's because there's, excuse me, so related to any decision-making going to the bigger picture, we're not going to town meeting for anything. So then the next major decision by town residents is just the zoning, which could potentially be next spring.
Well, we'll be asking for the community input at the October 11th workshop. And then
Right.
the whole drafting and public hearing process for zoning amendments, which comes before town meeting. And then the town meeting, the spring town meeting vote on zoning.
Right, but there's nothing at fall town meeting.
Well, at fall town meeting, if recommended, then the funds to add form-based zoning code work to Fort Point's contract, the $25,000 to $35,000. That funding request might be on town meeting floor for the fall.
I have a placeholder on the
Yeah.
town meeting. I have been holding a placeholder.
What is the date of the fall town meeting?
October 29th.
So we might be doing a presentation there, you think?
If
possibly?
someone asks, yeah, I'm always ready to justify everything we're doing, so yes.
Maybe
But it
that would be a
wouldn't
good idea, because a lot of times when it comes to voting, like in spring, when we have to do a vote, a lot of times people will say, I don't have enough information, because they show up to the town meetings, but not necessarily to the public forum in October 11th. So if we do a presentation fall town meeting in anticipation of spring town meeting, maybe on this research that the three of us are gonna do.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that even if we quote, lose the first round, which I don't really want to do, given our current interest in it, there's nothing that says I can't come back.
It's just a quick,
Right, and,
informative, so
Right.
people don't say, I don't know how to vote, because I don't know anything, I need to do more research. You know how we feel right now.
right, and I would recommend that as one point of contact with everybody. Another one that's worked really well has been the PSA announcements, recorded at LCTV.
Yeah.
Something quick.
That too, yeah, and then getting that on Facebook.
Well,
Which is
I do know that our interest in form-based code is already leaked out because there are people already getting concerned that somebody's going to design the entire common from scratch, as it were, so. The long period of time required for development yet hasn't sunk in. Anyway. Okay. I think that we can.
Do we want to let the consultants go?
Yes. Would I like to tell the
If
consultant-
anybody's still there?
Hi, are you guys still on the phone?
Yes.
We were just gonna let you guys go, so thank you so much. We're all
Okay,
set.
thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. You too, bye.
Maybe we just pick up.
Oh.
Thank you.
Before I move on to the other items, we land on a very good point, which is informing the public. So when our crack team, our task force has come back, I think we'll be in a better position to start doing some outreach and an explanation at various sites. That public meetings, whether it's the committees as well as LCTV and also local business and other organizations, and we can spread out and we can each, as it were, take on, and even if it's a 10-minute discussion, it would help inform folks what's going on, especially if we have pictures. Okay. I'm going to skip number 5 yet again because of the hour, unless somebody I think we're going to be busy for the next month or two at least. So at the moment, even though I'd like to take up some burning issues, I think we're on pretty close to overload, as it were. So unless there's no objection, I'd like to move on to public input. You're excited about everything. Okay, good.
Well, I don't know if I'd say that, but yes, no, I have.
Well, please, any comments?
No, it's all interesting. We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay, so our next meeting is shown here September 18th, but we have to change that, right?
Correct. Yeah. When do we want to meet next? Yeah, September 18th is Yom Kippur, first
Yep.
night, so it's not a good time to try to get together for this. So the planning board on September 20th, on that Thursday, I think we're trying to have a discussion on form-based code that evening. If it works out, Selectmen, Planning Board, and Master Plan Committee, I think I'll get together and talk about that. We have other planning board business to do first, so I'm trying to make the time frame work for that.
Okay.
But
There shouldn't be a rate determined set, but I won't be here for that one. Mainly because I planned ahead for other stuff, that's okay. Is there any problem that you see, and it's not that it's symbolic more than anything else, but Anna could certainly, Mike could certainly, any of us could certainly handle that pretty easily.
So this is September
20th.
20th, that's a Thursday. I'm trying to do we have another meeting penciled in before that? I don't think we did. Oh, we had the 18th, which of course we just moved, sorry.
You, Megan, watch out.
It's not.
Okay. All right. So the 20th looks like the tentative date, and Maren will keep us informed if there's slippage to yet another date. Okay.
So the 20th as a joint meeting with the planning board?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. 7 o'clock?
Probably later than 7.
Okay, their meeting starts at
Yes.
7 though.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all I really wanted to
Okay.
say.
Mara, and the only other thing I had in September was the 25th, where originally we were thinking about having an open house then, but I think that's gone by the
Right,
wayside.
that's the one that we moved to the open house, the workshop, whatever we're calling it.
Yeah.
October
Right,
11.
exactly.
Right.
So that would be the only other date that,
October the 11th would be the only other date? Is that what you said?
Well,
no. September 25th was the original date, but then we got moved, so that was the only other thing I had in my calendar.
Is the planning board on the second floor? Where do they meet? What's the location of that meeting?
in room 103.
103.
Yeah.
Okay. Minutes. Obviously, Anna's all excited about the
I
minutes.
was-
So for anybody on television, there is a fly
Yeah.
flying around
I
here.
know.
We're
Out
not
to get us
disgusted
all.
with each other.
I think it might be
Or if
Chase
we
or
are, we
something.
don't do it by saying that. There's a fly, and he's a very big bugger, and he's annoying.
Pesky, yes.
He wants to be on the committee. It might be Chase if he turned into a fly and he wanted to join us.
Oh, boy, okay. Poor Chase. He misses a meeting, he gets vilified.
So I
Anyway.
move to approve the minutes of
Yes.
July 17th.
Second.
I hear a motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? On to item number 9. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I have a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any further discussion? I hear none.
No.
All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your work tonight.